Hello to everybody who's joined us thus far. We are going to wait a couple more minutes before we get started. But as you can hopefully see on the screen, if you'd like to drop something in the chat that brought you joy in the past week, I know I personally have been dragging because of the time change. So would love to hear that. If you're willing to share, please put it in the chat and we will get started in just a couple of minutes.
Jessica, our president just signed in. Christina and Carly.
Guys, do we still have this as a meeting? Yes.
Yes,
okay.
ma'am.
I was confused by the presentation setup, and I was like, oh no. Okay, good. Well, hi everyone. Nice to see you. I'm like Lucy said, I'm Christina. I'm the HYLA president. And thanks for doing this with us. I'm really excited.
Yes, thank you for having us. Nice to meet you face to face.
Yeah, I know we've talked on the phone, but yes, nice to see you.
Jessica, do you happen to know one of our members, John Greil? I think you guys worked with him on a case.
Yes, we did. And he did an absolutely amazing, bang up, wonderful job. It was really a pleasure working with him.
Yeah, we clerked for the same judge. So that's how we met. And he told me about the case. And I was like, oh, we're partnering with them on a CLE. And I think it was this type of a case, right?
Yes, it was.
Amazing.
Yeah, it was really so wonderful working with him, and he got an amazing outcome for his client who got his license back, and it was just a great experience all around.
Good.
For anybody just joining us, we will get started in 1 minute. But as you see on the screen, if you feel so inclined to share something that has brought you joy over the past week, please feel free to add it in the chat.
The weather in Austin has been incredible as well. There's nothing like a beautiful sunny day to change your perspective.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's been nice and cool here too. It's made staying inside very difficult this week. And Lucy, just as a heads up to you, I did post on our social media about an hour ago reminding people that this was happening. So if you could be on the lookout for any last minute signups, that would be great.
Will do. Sounds great. Thanks.
All right. We are going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for being here today. Hopefully you're in the right place. Today we are talking about driver's license restoration, specifically talking about why you already have the skills to help a low-income Texan regain their license. So throughout this presentation, you're welcome to have your camera on or off, whatever makes you feel comfortable. We will be asking some questions and asking you to answer them in the chat. You're also very welcome to ask any questions that you may have in the chat. We're happy to kind of answer them as we go along. So with that said, I will introduce us. So my name is Jessica Johnson. I am the Director of Pro Bono Programs at Texas Fair Defense Project, and we'll talk in just a second about what Texas Fair Defense Project does. And I will pass it to my colleague, Carly Jo Dixon, to introduce herself.
Thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is Carly Jo Dixon. I'm the Managing Attorney of Client Services here at TFDP. I myself have a full caseload of the type of cases we're going to talk about today, representing folks who have driver's license suspensions, unpaid criminal legal debt. And we're going to talk through all of that today, but One of the things we want y'all to take away from this is if you decide to move forward and take cases with us, become a pro bono attorney, we're here. We're experts in the subject. We do this work, and we're beside you every step of the way. So thank you so much for being here.
We unmute. Okay, so these are the things that we are going to be discussing today. So first, we're going to be starting to talk about the cycle of ticket debt. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how, in a driver's license restoration case, you figure out what's going on in the case. How do you know why a person's driver's license is suspended? And then we'll talk a little bit about how to work up the case, the kinds of cases that you would receive. And then we'll talk about opportunities to help with Texas Fair Defense Project. And so before I go forward, I will just say, so Texas Fair Defense Project, we fight to end the criminalization of poverty. We take kind of a multi-pronged approach towards fighting the criminalization of poverty. One of those things is through policy work. We have a policy director who is very busy at the legislative session right now, trying to make things better for low-income Texans. We also do direct services, just like Carly Jo was mentioning, specifically helping with driver's license restoration, probation, fines and fees, access to counsel, and expunctions. We also do a community lawyering piece, partnering with local organizations to find out what things they need or that they want help with to create change on kind of a larger scale. And then kind of the third prong is impact litigation. So for example, right now we're involved in litigation trying to reform the cash bail system that's happening in Dallas. So that's a little bit about us. So with that said, we like to ground this conversation by hearing from our clients who have experienced what the cycle of ticket debt is and what it looks like.
Okay, I was without my license from till recently, to back to 2013. And the issues you have is you are limited to what you can apply for as far as work. If you get stopped and you have a job, you go to jail. So you lose your job and then you're back to square one. You know, you have to reapply somewhere, get another job. And all this time, you have gotten so far into debt behind there being no way out, that, you know, you're going to end up doing the same thing over and over and over.
It's pretty terrible. It's impacted almost every part of my life. Obviously, I'm not supposed to be driving without a license, but because I have to, I don't live where there's public transportation. So in order to get to work or take my kids to school or go to the grocery and buy food, I have to drive without a license. And so that's very scary, especially if you see a police person, a policeman, a woman. That part's terrifying.
I ended up in jail maybe 4 times behind a suspended license. And every time it was 3 weeks I had to stay. And there's no employer that will hold your job for 3 weeks, you know, especially in the field that I was in, construction. They get someone else.
So for years, there were a lot of things, jobs I'd have to turn down, jobs I'd lose, like if there was a bus strike or if I had missed a connection. And that's nothing you can write down. That's something you can explain to your boss because that has nothing to do with your employee.
Like, yes, there's school buses, but that's not always convenient for my kids because I have a son that's in UIL and I have to pick him up. I have a daughter that's after school tutoring, sports and stuff like that. So I needed a driver's license to get them there. But it's actually also impacted other parts of my life, like being able to rent an apartment. You need an ID to enroll in any sort of programs to better your future. Like I have a bachelor's degree and I wanted to enroll in a teacher certification program, but I can't because I don't have a valid ID. So even to get ahead, to get a better job, I'm not able to do any of those things without an ID, without a driver's license.
All right, so we heard from our clients there about how this cycle of ticket debt has affected their lives in many different ways. And so we want to talk a bit about how our clients get there. So when we're talking about Class C misdemeanors, we're talking about primarily traffic offenses, and a lot of which are poverty crimes. So we have a lot of clients with a failure to maintain financial responsibility, which just means no insurance. Maybe they're driving without a license, like many of our clients alluded to. Maybe their plates are expired or they don't have registration, things that all cost money to remedy. And so these are considered non-jailable or fine-only offenses. And so that means that they're not entitled to court-appointed counsel. However, if they fail to appear or fail to pay, then they can end up with warrants, with jail time, or losing their license. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So the courts that handle these Class C misdemeanors are municipal and justice of the peace courts, which are the highest volume courts in the state. And so just to kind of paint the picture of how high volume these courts are, we have a question for y'all to guess. So please type your answer in the chat. So how many total misdemeanor cases would you guess, so criminal cases, were on Justice of the Peace and Municipal Court dockets in 2020? Is it A, 17 million, B, under 15 million, C, over 20 million, or D, over 10 million? So put your guesses in the chat. Couple of guesses for over 17 million. Got guesses for over 20 million, under 15 million, all over the board. The answer is over 17 million. Congrats to everybody that put A in the chat. But yes, so 17 million cases of Class C tickets going through Justice of the Peace and Municipal Court dockets, which is a staggering number of cases and number of folks who are interfacing with the criminal legal system in this way. So we talk about this being a cycle because one, oftentimes if somebody gets pulled over, they receive multiple tickets. So maybe you get pulled over, you don't have a license, maybe your license is also invalid, maybe you were speeding or ran a red light. So you're looking at 3 or 4 tickets to start. And then a lot of folks believe that the only thing that they can do with these tickets is to pay. Mm-hmm. And when a person pays a ticket, they're actually pleading no contest to that ticket, and that means that it is a conviction. And so sometimes people will get on a payment plan, and as we saw a ton during the pandemic, that folks get on a payment plan and then their situation changes and they're unable to pay. So let's say we're talking about the example that I just mentioned. Maybe somebody has 4 tickets, maybe each one of those tickets costs about $200. So we're looking at an $800 ticket or set of tickets for one time that they're pulled over. And so then maybe they agree to pay it, they take a conviction, they're on a payment plan, and then they're unable to pay. So once they miss a payment, they can get, depending on the county or the court, they can get entered into the failure to appear or failure to pay program, which is also known as the omni-based program and how we generally refer to it. And so what the omni-based program is it's an opt-in program. So different courts or different counties can decide whether they want to opt into it. And the courts and counties that do opt into it, if a person fails to appear to take care of their ticket or fails to pay, so maybe they're on a payment plan and they miss a payment due to extenuating circumstances, then the court reports that failure to the omni-based program and it causes their license to be suspended. Warrants are often issued, and the person can have additional fees and costs essentially for being late on their payments. So it starts to build. And then just like we heard from our client earlier, once that license is suspended, if you get additional tickets and you already have a warrant out, you get pulled over again, you can do jail time. If you're a parent, you have your kids in the car, it could lead to CPS involvement, and it could cause you to lose your job. So it just becomes this tangled web that folks have a really hard time getting out of. And so there are alternatives to just paying the ticket, like community service or getting on a payment plan, but those alternatives aren't always offered. And part of that has to do with, of course, clerks can't give legal advice, and often courts have the most often used options, which are just to pay. And then there are some that say, okay, you can get on a payment plan, but in order to do that, you have to put down a down payment of half of what you owe. And so in the example that I gave, if somebody owes $800 and they're asked to pay $400 of it in order to even get on a payment plan, sometimes that's not accessible for people. So we've got another question for you all, just again to frame kind of how often this issue comes up. So how many Class C warrants would you guess that Texas Justice of the Peace and municipal courts issued in 2020? Is it A, over 750,000, B, over 1 million, C, over 150,000, or D, over 500,000? So go ahead and put your answer in the chat. All right, I'm seeing a couple of D's, over 500,000. Carly Jo's throwing her hat into the ring, I'm guessing A. A couple of B's. Guessing, so we have 750,000. The answer is B, over 1 million. So 1 million warrants issued for Class C tickets. So that is 1 million times that somebody could be pulled over and put in jail for a non-jailable offense that they weren't entitled to an attorney for. So needless to say, this is a huge issue. So I alluded to many of these things in the last slide, but so now arrest and jail time, of course, sounds completely unreasonable when you've never been entitled to having an attorney in the first place. But now, of course, with COVID, for some people, if you have health issues, if you're at high risk for COVID, your Class C ticket can then turn into a death sentence if you're particularly medically vulnerable. And then, as our client mentioned, it can lead to job loss if you are suddenly put in jail for an extended period of time and aren't able to tell anybody or call out to your job. And then, of course, custody concerns. So just like I mentioned, if you have your kids in the car and there's not anywhere for them to go, sometimes that will cause CPS to get involved. Oops, excuse me. And so the other big one is the driver's license suspension. And so many of our clients alluded to this, but there's a host of issues. So sometimes when folks' driver's licenses are suspended, sometimes the officer arresting them or the officer that pulls them over might physically take their license. And sometimes that's people's only form of ID. And so without an ID, it limits where you can live, what kind of housing you can get. And without being able to drive, depending on where your job is, that might limit the areas in which you can live in order for your job to continue to be accessible. And then as far as warrants, just like we said, and like we saw in the video, that a lot of our clients are living in fear of being pulled over, but feel they have no choice but to drive to try to take care of their children, take care of their basic needs. And a lot of folks don't have access to public transportation. So we can see how these things and this scheme of pulling driver's licenses, of issuing warrants, can cause people to get more into debt and more behind because they have less options for work, for school, for how to get around. All right, so we have one more question. So when we're talking about these omni-based holds that are causing people's licenses to get suspended, about how many omni-based holds would you guess have been issued on Texans' driver's licenses due to unpaid fines? So go ahead and type your answers in the chat. I'm seeing D, over 1 million, a couple of A's, a C, a B. And the answer is D, over 1 million. And so that's 1 million individuals who have omni-based holds that has led to their driver's license being suspended, 1 million Texans. So again, can't stress enough that this is an enormous issue, and this is the main reason why this program is so important. And now I'm going to pass it over to Carly Jo.
Thank you, Jessica. So Jessica really went through and explained like what our clients are facing, the scope of the problem in sheer numbers, it's huge. And then the actual breakdown of like how it affects an individual, you know, really reaching into all areas of their lives when someone can't drive legally and has this unpaid criminal legal debt. So we're gonna walk through, and I just wanna note, we have several like very detailed nuts and bolts trainings about how to do these cases. This is just an overview. So if at the end of this short section on like how to figure out what's going on, you're like, I still don't totally understand what I'm supposed to do, but you want to do it, we still have support in place. So you may not end it, you know, knowing exactly where we're at, but you should have a good sort of foundation for moving forward. So you already have the skills. All of you as attorneys have the skills to do these cases, even if you're like, I am not a criminal defense attorney. I've never thought about this work. I don't know what any of the words mean. I feel that way about other parts of the law, so I get it. But you have them already. And one of the skills you already have is using the internet. And there are two main places where we do searches to figure out, you know, what is going on with this person's driver's license. They're both DPS searches, DPS being the Department of Public Safety, our local sort of DMV in Texas. And in a perfect world, those two searches would be merged into one. There would be some sort of universal database you could go to and figure out what's going on with your driver's license, your unpaid tickets, but there's not. So it's a two-step process and sometimes more. One is your license eligibility. It's, you know, you can Google license eligibility, get there, and you really just need an individual's driver's license number or state ID, date of birth, and the last four of their social. And the information that you capture here really creates a roadmap to figure out what's going on with someone's driver's license and what are the steps to resolve it. And in a couple slides, we'll actually look at one of these reports so I can give you a sort of sense of what one might look like and the various ways that someone's driver's license might be suspended. The other report, I've got this up here, is the failure to appear or pay. And this is the omni-based program that Jessica mentioned. And this program is an opt-in program, by which I mean cities and counties opt in. They can decide to use it or not. There's nothing mandatory about it. And very recently, we worked with stakeholders in Harris County to get the Harris County Justice of the Peace to opt out, which released hundreds of thousands of people's driver's license from this program where they were really being penalized for being too poor to pay their tickets. This search is a little simpler. You need a driver's license or state ID and the date of birth. We check under both. DPS doesn't necessarily merge your driver's license and your state ID. So you may search under your driver's license and it look clear. And then when you go to your state ID, you've got these unpaid tickets holding it up. There's sort of like an escalating fees that compound when you can't afford to pay your tickets. And this is one of those fees. If your ticket gets entered into this program, it's a $30 fee. It's been reduced recently by the legislator for $10, but it wasn't backdated. So most people have a $30 fee. That's $30 per offense, not per ticket. So if you got a ticket for no insurance, no registration, and your taillight being out, and those tickets are sent to OmniBase, that's $90 in additional fees. And the hold stays. It's a hold on the renewal of your driver's license. If you go to court, you agree to do community service, the judge gives you 100 hours and a year to do them, that hold's gonna stay for that whole year. And so one of the things we're working right now at the legislature is trying to get those holds to lift as soon as you come into compliance. Because how are you gonna get to your community service provider or work over the course of a year if you still can't drive legally? And so Jessica is going to throw into the chat that first handout. This is a breakout from the driver's license eligibility sheet. And so I did my very best to make this so that everyone can see it. So hopefully you'll be able to pull that up. Should just take you to a Google Doc of a PDF. The very first thing, we have redacted this. It is someone's actual record so that it is confidential. The very first thing you're going to see as you scroll down is there is a lot of words on this, so many words. But you're going to see a status. That status is usually going to say not eligible, which is going to mean, okay, something's going on with this person's driver's license. And as we scroll through, we'll see what it might be for this particular individual. These are highly customized, meaning every person, you could go look at yours, probably there's nothing on it, probably it says eligible, but every person has a record like this with DPS. This particular person, as you scroll down, there's a grid, and there's a mandatory suspension, there's 2 of them in fact, that have end dates. Those are dates this person just has to wait in order to get their driver's license back. Some tickets, including driving without a driver's license, trigger another driver's license suspension. And so you can see there's a cycle. If you get a ticket for no driver's license and you're like, I'm going to be responsible, I'm going to take care of it. You go down, maybe you pay it. Well, that's a conviction. And suddenly you're in the exact same position as where you started with, is that you have a driver's license suspension. This individual also owes DPS a drug class. The end date on that is 12/31/9999. That's not a real date, which means that this hold is indefinite until they are able to get and take that 15-hour drug class and send proof of it to DPS. In Texas, any drug-related conviction, including possession of marijuana, triggers a need to take a 15-hour drug class. And if you don't, regardless of if your offense was drug-related, you lose your driver's license indefinitely. So underneath that, where it says other requirements, and that's what I've got up on my screen as well. It says you have outstanding citations under the failure to appear, failure to pay program. This is the Omni-based program, and this triggers the need to go look somewhere else. There is on here a little clue that this person has some of those unpaid tickets, but they're going to be in a different report. We're going to look at that report in just a minute. The next slide shows one final thing on this report, which is fees. They are reinstatement fees. These are fees that cannot be reduced or waived. There is no program. They're paid to DPS. And DPS doesn't consider them suspensions, but for low-income Texans, paying DPS $200 to get your driver's license back is functionally a suspension for many people. And so this is one of the places where people often get stuck, is with these reinstatement fees. Not everyone has them, but if DPS suspends your driver's license, they're going to charge you $100. In addition to the cost of the car, the $25 when you go down there to get it, to get your driver's license back. So let's look briefly before we move on at the handout number 2, which is that Omni-based report. And I like this one just to look at it because you can just see it's literally just, you know, some tickets listed out. So there's nothing complicated here, except that, as I mentioned before, there's no real universal database for where someone might have unpaid tickets. The tickets listed here are the tickets that courts have reported to DPS and are directly affecting someone's driver's license. But it is possible that someone could have unpaid tickets in other jurisdictions that courts just haven't reported yet. So they're basically license holds and suspensions waiting to happen. And so your skill in doing internet searches might go beyond these 2 websites and to looking at other courts' websites, local courts, you know, making a phone call to Houston Municipal Court. And we're going to talk next about some of that. So we're at, like I said, getting information. You've searched, you know, you've done those internet searches. The Houston Municipal Court assuming you can figure out how to search online, it's very tricky and it is hidden underneath a bunch of information that you or the person who has the tickets might not have. So assuming you can figure that out, once you get the information showing someone has tickets, there is no information there. Some courts, Harris County has a very detailed database, including copies of everything. If you will have someone who has a Harris County ticket, you can go look at a copy of the ticket online. That is not true in all the courts. It is not true in the Houston Municipal Court. You might have to make a phone call. And so calling the courts, figuring out what's going on, it's a skill you already have, you use daily in your practice, no doubt, and figure out what is going on with this case. Now, in criminal cases, cases can be pre-trial, meaning they have all the options still available under the law. They can plead not guilty. They can still plead no contest or guilty, which are kind of functionally the same. But that not guilty plea is important because they could still challenge the underlying offense. Post-conviction cases means they cannot challenge the offense anymore. They're just left with whatever the punishment is. In this case, it would be a fine plus the court costs. And really it's figuring out, how are they going to be able to take care of that? And we'll talk about that in a minute. But also when you call the courts, you want to find out, is there a warrant? What does this court do about warrants? How do they allow people to appear? What is the court doing right now? Can I send stuff over email? Some courts in Texas still use snail mail. Most of them use fax, and more, including during the pandemic, they use email. But can I email documents to the court? Is the court doing virtual appearances? Are they doing hearings by Zoom? Are they saying it's in person? And really just sort of like chatting with that clerk who answers the phone about what the court's doing and what's going on with your client's tickets. So now that you have figured it all out, you've done your internet searches, you've called the court, you've created not your client's narrative, but a narrative of the case. It's time to move on to next steps and figure out how do you work the case? What does it mean? And what skill do you need to use that you already have to do that? And the answer is paperwork. We are all mighty paperwork pushers. I often tell people that sometimes being a lawyer just seems like it's writing letters and doing paperwork, but it's kind of a superpower. And so you're going to put that skill to work in paperwork, but paperwork is a little interesting in this case. You're going to get a statement of inability to pay court costs from your client. That is part of, getting to know them, but also getting to figure out what's going on. Why can't they pay their ticket? What is the story of their life and their situation? And the statement of inability to pay is numbers. It's like, how much is your rent? What do you pay on food each month? But it's also the beginning of crafting that narrative. There's a couple of documents you have to give to the court that are very simple. But unless you give them to the court's not going to know you're this person's attorney. We occasionally will find that people have been vigorously working a case. They've got their motions ready, but they never told the court they were their attorney. And so we can't move forward until that happens. It's called a letter of representation agreement. Sometimes people just call it a notice of appearance. It's just a brief letter. It's mostly fill in the blank. And what you fill in is mostly your name, your email address, how the court should contact you. It just says, I'm their attorney. I would like the court to contact me, not my client, because they are represented now. And here's how you do that. You may ask for something else in those cases. In a post-conviction case, so a case where they already pled guilty. Now, Jessica touched on this. Pleading guilty doesn't necessarily mean going in front of a judge and saying, I'm guilty, give me my punishment. It might be sending in a partial payment. That's pleading guilty. It might be going down to the window and signing up for community service. That's pleading guilty. People often don't know that they have, in fact, pled guilty, even when they have, by agreeing to pay the ticket. For those of us who have means, we have probably pled guilty to tickets by paying them over the phone with a credit card or sending in a check or money order, and not really thought about the repercussions of that. And so, if that case is guilty, you're going to ask the court to waive what they owe. It's kind of a two-step process. And we will get into what those steps are when we talk about storytelling in a little bit. But that's what that motion for waiver is. It's your ability to craft creatively and truthfully, to craft a story about your client's financial situation and life situation, so that when the judge reads it, they have no choice but to grant your motion and to give your client the relief that they're asking for. Post-conviction cases are mostly just paperwork. Occasionally you'll get an actual hearing in front of the judge, but mostly they're just paperwork. And here's where that paperwork, like I said, allows for some sort of like creative storytelling. After you've gotten the numbers, that statement of inability to pay costs from your clients, you've drafted the sort of more rote documents for the court, your notice of appearance, and then you're gonna ask for waiver. And so the law really is on our side in this case, in that waiver is possible under the law, but it's not a straight shot. So the way the law is you can get a payment plan, you can get community service, you perhaps could get credit for the time you've already spent in custody. We talked about jail time and warrants earlier. People are arrested for these charges all the time, and the court does not credit the time you've spent in jail unless you ask for it, or waiver. And like waiver seems like the best. But you have to get there through the law, which is be too poor to pay your ticket and have a hardship. The law says an undue hardship in completing community service. And so that is what you're going to argue in the motion that you draft. This person cannot afford to pay their ticket. They're legally indigent. Their statement of inability to pay shows that. Maybe their government benefits show that. They can't pay their tickets, but also they can't do community service. We are arguing right now for waiver in all the cases because of COVID. We should not, in our opinion, be asking our clients to go out into the communities even more than they have to. Most, if not the majority of our clients, are already essential workers. They're already risking their lives every day, at grocery stores, at restaurants, at childcare facilities, like doing the work to keep our society running. And we don't think it's just or equitable to be forcing them to go and find a community service provider during this global pandemic, if they even can find a community service provider. Here locally in Austin, Goodwill is not allowing volunteers and hasn't, for the last 11 months, with no real, we don't know when things are going to open back up. I have a client right now who a judge who lives in Houston, who a judge wants to do community service, and she insisted that she could do it at the local library, but the library's closed. They're not letting people inside. They're not letting volunteers in. And so finding a place to do community service, regardless of the other sort of risk involved in the pandemic, is really difficult right now because folks are really trying to keep their own operations safe and secure. We also are, and we have a little short, if you decide to take a case, mini training on this, but like really trying to make sure that courts are allowing for virtual appearances, both for our clients, but for us, to really reduce the risk related to COVID in the courtroom. You can file, and we have documents to help you do that, templates, draft motions, to argue for a virtual appearance, whether that is like full on virtual through Zoom in a Zoom courtroom. There is nothing so fun. I don't know how many Zoom courtrooms y'all have been in, but there is nothing so fun as watching a clerk try to figure out who's in what room in a Zoom courtroom. It is the best. Or just sitting in the waiting room for an hour, hoping you're in the right place. I know that Jessica did that very recently. She's just like the boring staring at your computer, but court is different. Our lives are different. And so there are full virtual, there are also telephonic, which is just a phone call, which is perhaps not how we imagined lawyering to be but where we're at right now during this pandemic. And so there's a lot of options that courts are using that are not just coming in person. So that was working through those post-conviction cases. I want to cycle us back to pretrial cases. And those are those cases that are like fully open. They have all the options available under the law, including I want to plead not guilty and I want a trial. Now, trials are far off in the future, both just generally, but also during the pandemic. I got a trial notice this week for February 2022. Whether that is even real or not remains to be seen, but we're not really focused on trials right now. What we're focused on is like doing a legal assessment of the case, because you can still challenge the underlying offense in a pretrial case. So it's a little different than a post-conviction case. Maybe you get to the point where you're asking for those alternatives, payment plans, community service, waiver, but you're not starting there. You're starting by entering that notice of appearance, that letter of representation, and you're asking for the documents in the case. It's discovery, but it's really just, you need a copy of the ticket, you need a copy of the charging document. In this case, in Class Cs, they're called complaints, which is a little confusing. And then you're just figuring out, are there any defects in the ticket? Did they fill all the pieces out? Is the name on here? Does the date make sense? Every now and then you'll get a ticket and none of it makes sense. And that might be enough to throw out the case. It also might not. And so you'll want to say, like, who is the officer? Sometimes I do a formal request to the police department to figure out, is the officer still there? Do they have any disciplinary reports? But that's not where I start. I start with that skill you already have, which is using the internet. And I use that skill to see, is there any news about the officer? I recently was doing that and I found out that the officer had passed away several years ago. And so it was really a easy email to the prosecutors. I was like, hey, I was doing some research. I found this news article about the officer in these tickets. Can we dismiss them? And they dismissed them that same day. They can't prosecute them anymore because they don't have a witness. There's also a statute of limitations in Class C cases. Now, this is a little tricky because it's not just 2 years. 2 years is the statute of limitations. Starts at the offense date, but then it's told if they file the charging document, that complaint. So if they have a complaint on file within 2 years, statute of limitations doesn't matter. But many courts don't file charging documents. And so one of the things with these cases that you get to do in your legal assessment is figure out, like, does the court even have all the documents it needs? Or can I file a motion to dismiss? And once again, this is a place where we have plenty of templates and resources if you wanted to file a motion to dismiss. Also, sometimes the client may have resolved the issue. It may be a no insurance ticket and they have insurance now. Now, not every prosecutor, and we will talk about negotiation next, not every prosecutor is going to care that the issue is going to be resolved. But if you can walk into court or phone into court from the comfort of your bed and say, hey, you know, I've got this client, they fixed everything. Maybe we just let them go. Some prosecutors are going to do it. Now, some won't. Some will care in a different way about these. But, you know, the most you can do to show up with the issues resolved, the better position your client's going to be in and the better offer you're likely going to get from the prosecutor. So after you've done your legal assessment, you go into negotiations. Negotiating with the prosecutor, the best thing you could get is a dismissal. Case is done, dismissed. Occasionally they'll want that omni-based fee if the case was entered. Next best is deferred disposition. This is like an unsupervised probationary period. You don't get any new tickets for up to 180 days under the law, usually about 90 days, and you jump through whatever other hoops they're asked for, tickets dismissed. That is pretty good as well. You can get community service or waiver on a deferred disposition. Now, I have had judges say they don't do that, but they are allowed to do that under the law. Next best, bordering on bad, is a conviction. Convictions can trigger other collateral consequences. So a conviction can, as we talked about before, create a new driver's license suspension. Convictions for certain Class Cs that aren't traffic related might have other implications for housing, immigration status. So convictions are a little tricky, but you can use them strategically. Like my client will plead no contest to this if we dismiss these other ones. And if you get to that point, we can talk with you about, you know, what is the strategy there, and which tickets might we be able to play around with, and which one should we avoid a conviction at all costs, because it actually makes the problem worse. And then trial. I have been doing this work for a little over 4 years. I have asked for trials. I have thought cases. I have several cases right now that are like pointed squarely in that direction. I've never had a trial. And so I say that because it is possible, one, to walk out of negotiations, not as dramatically necessarily. I think I try to, everyone has their own negotiation style. You may already know what yours is. And if you don't and you start developing that, I start with be nice. I don't always end with be nice, but that's where I start. But I have more than once said, what you're offering just doesn't work. Let's just set this case for a jury trial. Suddenly, the offers get better. And often they get good enough that my client will take them. And so we've never actually gotten a trial. Also, prosecutors will and have sort of drug me and my client all the way to the eve of trial to dismiss the cases. That's a good outcome. It's, you know, the outcome we wanted. It's not a great outcome, but because of the time and energy, but you can use trial strategically in that way as well. Your client is at the driver's seat. We practice and encourage in our volunteers a client-centered practice, which means that your client is in charge of what happens. They may really want a trial. I've had clients who really, really want to tell the judge and somebody what happened to them was wrong. And then sometimes after they figure out the time commitment, that getting to the point where the person who would listen to them is possibly going to listen to them is so far in the future and so labor intensive on their labor, being in court, waiting, all of that, that they're like, no, let's do this other thing. So I've never had a trial. If you get a case to trial, we would love to help you on it, as well as give you the tools you would need to be successful in doing it. So we have trial on here because it is in some ways like people want to get in court. I love being in court, but it's kind of like a unicorn. And so it is an option, but it is hard to get to. Like I said, if you get that far, we are here with you 100%. That could be second chairing with you. It could be, you know, providing you. I have a lot of pretrial motions, which is like motions when you're headed to trial to file with your court, with the court. And so we would be very excited. And hopefully if you took a case and got this far, you would be very excited as well. So we talked about this briefly earlier, but we have a little, we've been calling them bite-sized trainings that we've recorded that's really about virtual advocacy. And it's not so much about like, how do you do voir dire in over Zoom, or like, you know, how do you negotiate in a, you know, Zoom hearing? It's more about how do you make the court allow you to appear virtually? And there's a couple of different tools that the Texas Supreme Court and the Office of Court Administration has given us. And those tools include the emergency orders. The Supreme Court has issued several. The last one they issued in February or March, most recent one, isn't as strong as the one they issued in December. In December, they basically said nobody should be appearing in court in person at all. And they've relaxed that a little bit, but it still says that court should make every effort to allow people who asked to appear virtually. And to that end, we have motions for virtual appearance. I have filed several. One, the judge called me back to tell me, of course, I could appear by phone, which seemed a little over the top to have the judge call me and not the clerk. But nobody has said no. Nobody has said, actually, you have to appear in person, despite filing this motion. So those have been very successful. Some courts aren't doing anything, like full on stalled out, full stop, nothing. Now those courts are rare. Usually you can still send in motions and the judge will review and possibly sign them, and call the prosecutor. There's only a handful of courts around the state who basically packed up their bags and went home. And so you may find one of those. It may be like, there's no settings, they are indefinitely shut down. Excuse me. But I find that I can still find ways around that, whether that's phone calls with the prosecutor and emails or motions, to try to get some movement for my client's case. It continues to be a great time to take a case, in part because so much of the advocacy related to these types of cases used to be waiting, sitting in court and waiting. Your case being called with 100 other ones, I'm exaggerating, 50 other cases, and it may be an hour and a half, in court. And that really has changed. Sometimes there's some waiting in virtual hearings, but it's really different than the before times. And so it's a great time to take a case. You can likely, do most of the work from your home or your office. And yeah, it's really fun work, even in this virtual space.
All right, so now that we've kind of talked through what it looks like, what the stakes are here, how many folks you can help, we're going to talk about the opportunities that TFDP has for folks to get involved with this cause. So first, as Carly alluded to, we have direct representation. And so that's the primary focus of our pro bono program, is to help with these driver's license restoration cases. Right now, there are many available cases, specifically in Houston Municipal, partially due to they originally were functioning in person. And so we've been advocating to make sure that they're complying with the Supreme Court orders and really encouraging virtual appearances and specifically strategizing around that. We have samples and forms, which Carly also alluded to, such as that motion for waiver. We have several samples that are specifically speaking to COVID times, to the undue hardship or undue burden of community service, etc. We have recorded training similar to this one, and then also, as Carly alluded to, kind of our mini trainings, our bite-sized trainings that talk about a specific topic. So when pro bono attorneys are working a case, maybe they've watched a longer training like this one, and we have some other ones recorded, but then they think, oh, what was that thing about virtual advocacy? And then there's a smaller bite-sized training that they can watch to refresh their memory on that specific topic. And then we also do one-on-one case supervision. Carly, Joe, and I both do these sorts of strategizing meetings. So if somebody hits a snag, or if you say, hey, I think I know everything that I need to do, but I just want to check in and make sure. Or was this offer that the prosecutor gave me reasonable? What would you do? What documents should I gather that's going to help my client's case? Does this statement of inability look right to you, et cetera? So Carly, Joe, and I are on call to help with any questions that people may have. And then, like I said, we do review pleadings. We'll add pointers and tips based on our experience that we've had to make sure that you and your client are putting your best foot forward. And so, like I said, these really are what we say low stakes practice, high impact results. So many of our attorneys, our pro bono attorneys, are civil attorneys. And so before I was at TFDP, I worked at Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid, primarily working with survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault and family law cases. And so I can certainly commiserate. I know that for some people, there's kind of this ick factor or this alarm of, I don't know anything about criminal cases. How am I going to figure this out? But like I said, we are here to help with that. And specifically, it's really important because civil legal aid is so important. Obviously, I'm biased since that's what my background was in. However, these driver's license cases are in this weird kind of middle ground where, yes, they're criminal cases, so many civil legal aid programs can't help with them. But since folks are not entitled to an attorney, for people to get help with these kinds of cases, you really have to rely on pro bono programs like ours. So it's a really important cause. We have lots of documents and things to help folks. We are happy to do as much hand-holding as you need to get started with your first case and beyond. And maybe you can tell from this presentation that Carly Jo and I really enjoy this work. We think that it's really fun. And we found that many of our pro bonos really enjoy having this hands-on interaction with their client and can end a case saying, this person got their license back, they're gonna be able to get a better job, they no longer have to be in fear of getting pulled over and because they have warrants, et cetera. So it can have a huge impact on people's lives. So we also, a big part of our pro bono program is also clinics. However, because of COVID, they are somewhat functioning differently. So we used to do clinics specifically in person and could serve up to maybe 100 or so people at a time. And it's just a one-time commitment, going through, figuring out, just like Carly Jo was talking about with those searches, figuring out what's going on with the person's license, what's holding them up, and then giving them a packet of documents to help them figure out their next steps to try to get their license back. Now we found that many of our clients don't have the technology to be able to do these virtually. So we did a few virtual clinics allowing people to kind of sign in from their homes. We found that they weren't super helpful for our clients because one, the technology was difficult. And then if we give them a bunch of documents or paperwork to send to the court, they then have to figure out how to print it. Many of our clients don't have printing access, or at least not free printing access. And then we're having to physically mail things to the court as well. And so what we've primarily been doing, we've had a few clinics that are a hybrid model. And so all of the volunteers are virtual, but the clients are in person with the service provider. So for example, we did one in the Austin area with Goodwill. And so those clients were able to come in person and have Goodwill staff help them with the technology, help them print out things, et cetera. And then the volunteers themselves were in person. And so when we have opportunities for future clinics, et cetera, or if it's something that you think your firm or any group or association that you're a part of would be interested in partnering on clinics, we're always happy to talk about that. Then, of course, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we do impact litigation and often are looking for partners who are interested in making those kind of large scale changes through litigation. And so if that's something that you think that you or your firm would be interested in, please reach out to me because we do have opportunities pop up. And then the last one, of course, maybe you're saying, Carly Jo, I listened to your presentation. It all sounds really great, but I can't, I'm not interested, but I would love to do some research. I would love to write a memo. That's more my speed. We always have room for that as well. But that said, I hope that you will take away from this presentation, since you know how to use the internet, you know how to do paperwork, you know how to talk to a clerk, you maybe have some skills in negotiating, maybe you've got some kiddos right at that tween age where you have to learn how to negotiate your best to get what you want and ask them to do what you need them to do. So I guarantee you that everybody on this call has the skills to take these cases. And again, we are absolutely here for you to help you through it if it's something that you decide to do. So with that said, we're gonna drop a couple of links in the chat. So one is, Carly Jo already did it because she's the best. She's always 2 steps ahead of me. So if you're interested in taking a driver's license restoration case, we've got that form down there that you can fill out, which is just your basic information so that we know to reach out to you and send opportunities. And then we always appreciate feedback. If there is some constructive criticism or you just enjoyed the presentation and want to let us know, please fill out the feedback survey, and the link is in the chat. And so you can also see the CLE number that is listed. I will say it out loud because I believe we do have some folks who are on the phone. The CLE number is 174097370. I'm going to say it one more time. 174097370. 97-370. And so with that, I'm going to open it up for any questions. You're welcome to type your questions in the chat. And since we've got a medium-sized group, folks are welcome to unmute and ask any other questions that they may have.
Jessica, I'm wondering if there's any way I could express interest in taking on a case, but say in 2 or so months from now. I'm HYLA president until the end of May, and after that, I expect I'll have some more free time. So should I fill out the form now or fill it out later if I would like to work on a case, but don't currently have the bandwidth?
Yeah, I think so. Totally fine. When you sign up and fill out the survey, it's not that we will say, okay, you must take a case and you must take it tomorrow. Basically, it just means that we'll send you the opportunities, and it is okay for you to say, thanks for sending, I'll get back, I'm interested in 2 months and not now, or just ignore our emails, or, whatever.
Okay.
And one other thing I'm realizing that I meant to mention as well is while these cases, you can have an individual impact on one person helping them get their license back, or however many people you represent. But the other part is here in Texas, we have 254 counties, I believe. Hopefully that's the right number.
It is.
Yes. Okay. I always get it wrong. 254 counties. And so Carly Jo, Texas Fair Defense Project is a small but mighty team. We have 11 staff. Carly Jo is the only person who has a full-time caseload of all Class C tickets. And while she is willing and in some ways able to take cases in all 254 counties, it's really important, especially because these tickets generally are handled pro se, and that it's meant to be a pro se friendly process, even though people obviously stumble through this process. But it's good to have attorneys going into different courts and then kind of reporting back to say, hey, I filed a motion for a waiver and this judge just said they don't do that. And then we know, okay, that this is an area where we need some more education. Maybe we could send some more attorneys into that court, et cetera, just so that we can keep track of which courts are following the law and which courts are ensuring that low-income Texans have meaningful access to this process and are able to address their tickets. So there is both a micro and a macro level result when folks are able to help with driver's license cases. Are there any other questions anybody has? All right, well, seeing none, we so appreciate your time for joining us today. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out, and we will be sure to send these links in a follow-up email to make sure if you want to give feedback or if you're interested in taking a case that you can sign up.